You're listening to The Real Story with me, Rithala Shah. This week, we're going to discuss an issue that might be one of the longest-lasting consequences of the Islamic State group, the fate of the foreign women and their children who joined them. This month, the story of Shamima Begum brought the legal and ethical dilemmas they present sharply into focus. She created a stir 3 years ago when, at the age of 15, she used her elder sister's passport to leave London and travel to Syria to join IS. Grainy CCTV images showed her dressed in a hooded jacket and trousers, an ordinary teenager making an extraordinary choice. The British authorities said they'd try to find her, but there was no news of her until now, when she was found in the Al-Hojj refugee camp in northern Syria.
I'm sorry for all the men that have lost their women and children because of the attacks back in the UK and other countries. It wasn't fair on them. They weren't fighting anyone. They weren't causing any harm, but neither was I, and neither are the women who are being killed right now back in Baghos. Yeah.
But I think you're wrong. You did cause harm because you helped this terrible regime which was murdering people, which was mounting terror attacks. You joined them, you gave them support. You became a poster girl for them.
Like I said, the poster girl thing was not my choice. I would not have, done that. But me just going there and being a housewife and just sitting at home and them taking care of me is not really in any way help. Like, I'm not paying for their bullets. I'm not paying for them to be trained.
Why do you think, after you've joined this group which has rejected everything that Britain has offered, that you should still be able to go back to Britain?
Because I don't actually agree with everything that they've done, and that's why I actually do support some British values, and I am willing to go back to the UK and settle down again and rehabilitate.
Shamima Begum speaking to the BBC's Quentin Somerville. But it's not just her. There are potentially thousands of women who now find themselves in a similar situation of limbo. The promise of an ideal life under the caliphate has evaporated. Many are now living in squalid camps controlled by Kurdish forces who want to get rid of them. Meanwhile, there's strong opposition to their return in Europe and America. After all, why should someone who rejected Western values be welcomed back, be given the chance of rehabilitation? Or on the other hand, is there an obligation for Western liberal democracies to take back their citizens, even if they may pose a security threat? This week on The Real Story, we've brought together 3 guests who've been following these events closely. They're Joana Cook. She's with the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College London. She's been studying the role of women in violent extremism. Haris Rafiq is the CEO of Quilliam International, a London-based organisation that works on counter-extremism. He advises various governmental agencies on de-radicalisation of militant groups. And Jessica Triscoe-Darden, fellow with the American Enterprise Institute in Washington and co-author of Insurgent Women, Female Combatants in Civil Wars. Welcome to you all. Joanna, if I can begin by asking you, what was your immediate reaction when you heard Shamima Begum and her plea to come, and she very specifically used this word, home?
I think what's really struck me about the case of Shamima is that she is one of at least only 4,700 women that we've accounted for in our own research. You know, her perspective, her story is something that's really representative of the kind of complexity and the diversity of women that have been over there.
Complexity, but Haris Rafiq, when the story of Shamima Begum emerged, one article in The Economist talked about the once belligerent radicals act now like aggrieved tourists stranded on a package holiday. Is that a response that you can relate to?
I think that's a response that a lot of people can relate to. Somebody actually compared her and other girls that have gone out to join ISIS as victims, but that argument is false. And the reason why that's false is that, let's take my hometown of Rochdale, which has been in the news for the grooming gangs. Those girls were plied with alcohol. Those girls were plied with drugs. Those girls were misused and abused in a different way to the way that Shamima was. Shamima actually did the research. She'd looked for these groups. She'd looked for the ideology. She'd looked for the, in inverted commas, purity of the concept. So it's not the same kind of victim. It is somebody who was a youngster, a minor, who went out there, but she made that decision.
And for listeners around the world who may not be familiar with the grooming gang story, these were groups of teenage girls who were lured into sexual activity, drug running, all kinds of things by gangs of men in various towns around the UK, and there are cases going on even now. Jessica, I wonder what your reaction was then to Shamima Begum.
I think in the clip that you played, she raises a really interesting point about how the group was taking care of her. She said specifically them taking care of me. And so this idea that she felt cared for and taken care of by a listed terrorist organization really points to the centrality of women and families within that organization.
Joanna, you talked about numbers. Just give us a sense of how many women from around the world who went to join IS may now be trapped or find themselves in these camps in Syria.
We looked at 80 countries from around the world, and what we were able to determine for the first time with evidence is that at least 4,761 women, or approximately 13% of those that we accounted for over there, were women. But the thing is that this is such a vast underestimation because of the 80 countries we looked at, we could find figures for only half of these.
I think there's an interesting aspect of what's happened over the last few years that has changed the dynamics of the way women especially have gone out to join Islamist insurgencies or the Islamic State, ISIS in this instance. If we look at Al-Qaeda, for example, when they called the global jihad, they didn't want women to come and join them. What they wanted was foreign fighters or men to come out and join the cause. They weren't actively stopping women from coming in to Afghanistan and other places around the world. What ISIS did was they wanted to build a community, build a state that functions through a whole various bunch of different ways. And in that, they needed, from their perspective, women to come out there and be mothers, to be wives.
I want to explore this idea of the role of women and some more, but I just want to think about where these women find themselves right now. Shamima Begum was among those who fled IS's last remaining enclave in Baghouz in eastern Syria as Kurdish forces closed in. And as the Middle East correspondent of the Daily Telegraph newspaper, Josie Enser, explained, she's now one of those among thousands in those overcrowded camps.
There's two main camps that foreigners are going to, and the Britons are in both of them. There's Roj camp, which is slightly smaller than Al-Hol, which has become sort of out of control in terms of population numbers in recent weeks. But yeah, I mean, conditions are bad. I mean, as I said when I went there, that even by the standards of Syria, the conditions in these camps are just awful. I mean, when I was there, I saw, children defecating out in the open just because of the complete lack of latrines that are there, and they're completely struggling to deal with the numbers that have been arriving in the last few weeks. I think everyone's been surprised by how many women and children have been coming out of this last pocket of ISIS territory.
So is there enough shelter, enough food? Is there access to medical help?
There's not enough shelter, there's not enough food. When I was there about 10 days ago, there was a group of foreign women speaking in broken Arabic. I think they were probably from Central Asia, just screaming at the camp manager because it was raining and, the rain was turning into sleet and their children were sort of hiding under their abayas. And they were just shouting at them and saying, we can't stand out here in the rain. What are you going to do? Leave us out here to die? And the camp manager just didn't have any answers, really. He said, you're going to have to wait until the aid agencies have been able to bring some more, which, could have been 2-3 days from then. And people were forced to sleep out in the open because there just weren't enough tents to go around.
So who are these women? Where are they from? Are they all from similar backgrounds? Give us an idea of who we're talking about.
So in Al-Hol camp, which is the main one, I think the numbers currently are something like 50,000 people. It's divided in two sections. So there's the Syrian and Iraqi section, and there's the foreigners section. And in the foreigners section, it's just women and children. And these women come from everywhere, from Kazakhstan, from France, the UK, Indonesia, Trinidad and Tobago. And they just sort of are all lumped in this camp together trying to get by. But I mean, I got a sense that even within the different sort of linguistic and national groups, that some of them were more extreme than others, and some of them were sort of ruling the pecking order, as it were. So the Britons just seemed to kind of be keeping their head down and trying to get by. And from what we heard, it seemed like some of the more radical women were from Russia, from Egypt, from Tunisia, who were sort of, in some instances, burning Syrians' tents who they didn't think were Islamic enough or had been saying bad things about the Islamic State. And they had to be separated from the rest of the group. And they seemed to be kind of still very dogmatic and still very in support of the Islamic State, and smacking other people's children for singing and dancing, that sort of thing.
So not only are the conditions poor, but tensions between those who find themselves there too.
Yes, exactly.
And do you think there is a realisation or an acceptance that IS has lost, the caliphate is over?
No. I would say a lot of the people that we spoke to, were told we're going to be quiet for some time and, don't do anything just yet, but we will regroup and we will gain in strength. Especially the people that have been leaving in the last few weeks. I mean, these are the diehard supporters that have chosen to be there until the end. I mean, most of them, some of them, of course, have been held against their will. But for the large part, these are the people that have thought that they were willing to die for the caliphate.
Josie Enser of The Telegraph. Jessica, you touched on the idea of IS as a community. Why do you think these women, young women often, were drawn to IS in the first place?
I think, of course, there is a vast array of reasons why women are joined to violent militant groups. And I think in some sense, Shamima Begum's narrative is one of a, young woman seeking adventure who was pulled in by this promise of an idyllic life under the Islamic State. Other women's narratives are different, right? Clearly, some traveled with family members, traveled to join husbands. There was an element of coercion, perhaps, but certainly a less voluntary journey to the Islamic State. In my own research on insurgent women, we find that domestic violence, repression within the home, and other kind of home dynamics can often drive women towards armed groups. And so I think it's very important to look at each woman's case on an individual basis and to establish some sort of screening process, perhaps in these camps, perhaps in another context, that can clearly establish women's roles within the Islamic State, any potential crimes that they may have committed, and the jurisdiction that different states may have over those crimes.
So, Joanna, why they went there, and then what did they do once they were there?
I really agree with Jessica's point there that these persons do have to be assessed on an individual basis. And what this means is that if we talk about push factors, what were the diverse factors in that individual's life that pushed them out of it? What were the factors that pulled them towards that organization? And it has to be assessed on that individual basis.
We haven't even begun to talk about the fact that many of these women now have children. How does that affect the way in which they are treated by the countries which they may still regard as home? How do you welcome them back? Do you have them back, Joanna?
I think just to give the listeners here a concept of just how many minors we're talking about as well. Again, in our research, we accounted for at least 4,640 minors, or about 12%. And we think that this is, again, a vast underestimation just because, again, under half of the countries in the world we looked at did not even produce figures on this. But what we were able to demonstrate with certainty was that even if we look at Western Europe, at least 566 minors were born to at least one Western European parent over there. And this is now an intergenerational issue that if we do not act pragmatically, if we are not proactive in responding to the concerns and situations of these persons now, it will be a problem for the next generation to come.
Well, last week it emerged that the British government was taking steps to strip Shamima Begum of her citizenship. Under UK law, the Home Secretary can remove someone's citizenship if they're satisfied that deprivation is conducive to the public good. And additionally, there should be reasonable grounds for believing the person would be able to become a citizen of another country. Richard Walton's a senior fellow at Policy Exchange think tank, and he's a former head of counter-terrorism at Scotland Yard here in London. He was in charge of the investigation when Shamima Begum and her friends ran away to Syria in 2015, and he told the BBC that the Home Secretary was right to remove her citizenship.
The Home Secretary's got the privileged position of in being receipt of a wealth of intelligence for intelligence agencies that work across the world, including from our other countries in Europe and elsewhere. So he has a different picture to the one we have. He's able to measure the extent of the threat that is posed by this particular individual, and indeed by some of her family, but by potentially the husband that she married to. So there's a bigger picture he has to face. And obviously he has also to make the difficult decision, the judgment, that none of us have to make, faced with both the intelligence picture and also the legal questions and the legal dilemmas that also exist in this complex case.
I think it's since emerged that it will be perhaps more complicated than we first understood to strip Shamima Begum of her citizenship. But Jessica, do you think that this is a reasonable way for a government to act? After all, these are complicated cases. It may be difficult to prove that this woman did anything wrong in a court of law. Stripping her of citizenship is a clear way of declaring that these actions are completely unacceptable.
I think that the key question, though, what goes to the really heart of this issue is, where does one's allegiance lie? It is very clear in these instances that these women have pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. Yes, the Islamic State was a non-state actor. It was not a recognized foreign country. But the intent of many of these women was to live under the Islamic State for the rest of their lives, to contribute to that state, to build that state, to populate that state. And so this argument that, yes, I may have burned my passport, I may have traveled illegally, I may have joined this terrorist group. In the clip that you played, Miss Begum said some British values. She's still not accepting that she has to return to a society that is in many ways antithetical to the image of life under the Islamic State that she embraced.
You were shaking your head.
Yeah, I think our UK Home Secretary's got it totally wrong, and as has President Trump in the US, because he's just recently denied somebody a returnee access and citizenship for the US as well. There is a legal argument. The Home Office believes that they have a legal argument and she won't be stateless, and the family will argue that she is. By stripping her of her citizenship, she will become stateless. The point here is not that. The point here is that we, first of all, do not deport our criminals to Australia anymore. Secondly, by the same argument that we, for 10 years, tried to get Abu Qatada deported back to Jordan, we wanted his home country to take responsibility for his crimes, the same argument has to be used consistently, and we have to take our criminals back. And we have to
the counter argument to that is that citizenship comes with rights and responsibilities.
She was born here. By the Home Secretary actually stripping her or trying to strip her of her citizenship, as for the first time in my 53 years of age, made me feel almost like a second-class citizen.
Because
at any given time, I could be stripped of my citizenship and not being treated in the same way that somebody who doesn't hail originally from another country wouldn't be stripped.
Joanna.
When we saw Islamic State recruiting individuals, when they were really kind of early on trying to call people towards their so-called caliphate, one of the narratives that they really used was the idea that you don't belong in your society, you belong here with us. And by that, it really was trying to play with the idea that you do not belong in the countries from which you were born. You belong as part of this larger project that they were building. And I think a lot of the conversations we see around citizenship now are currently playing into this in a way that that does kind of resonate with some of their earlier recruitment narratives.
And Jessica, what is the danger if you make people stateless, that you're simply exporting the problem to other countries that may be even less well equipped, perhaps, to keep tabs on some of these individuals?
I think what this debate over denaturalization or the stripping of citizenship deprivation in the UK context points to is the lack of justice mechanisms to hold these women to account. If we had a system wherein these women could be held accountable for their complicity in the vast crimes committed by the Islamic State, which range from murder to kidnapping to sexual slavery, then I think we would have a better sense of how to deal with these women, rather than resorting to, of course, what are extreme measures. The question, though, in my mind, is less what happens with these individual women than what happens to the thousands of children that Joanna has identified in her research. So we know that since 2000, there have been more than 124,000 child soldiers demobilized from armed groups. Since 2013, 42,000 child soldiers have participated in some sort of reintegration program, right? What is the work that's being done to identify these children, to assign them nationality, to repatriate them, and to reintegrate them?
I want to come back to that some more a little bit later in the programme, but Harris, you were again disagreeing with what you were hearing just there.
We have mechanisms to actually deal with these returnees, especially with Shamima Begum's case. She has admitted that she's broken the Terrorism 2006 law, which means that she could get up to a maximum of 6 years imprisonment. However, what is more important is that she should be brought back and she should be tried, but she can go through a de-radicalisation and rehabilitation programme.
There would be a fear amongst many people that while she may have been complicit in the actions of IS, is there the evidence that would stand up in a court of law that someone like her could be brought to justice?
Yes, there is evidence right now by her own admission that she has joined a prescribed terrorist entity called ISIS or IS under different names. Therefore, she has broken the law and she could go to prison for 6 years.
Joanna, do you share those concerns?
I agree with the concern about actually being able to prosecute women. And so, for example, in ISIS propaganda, women did feature very, very minimally, but not to the same extent that men did. So when we saw any kind of video evidence or any kind of evidence of them committing crimes or being implicitly acting out these crimes, things that could be very valuable in a court of law as evidence, we didn't see the same kind of evidence for women to the same extent. But I also very much agree with the point that to bring these individuals back, to try them in a court of law here, is much more, again, I'm going to use the word pragmatic, because I think that we do have to talk about this entire situation in terms of pragmatism. Even in the cases where some of these women may not necessarily be charged and convicted in a court of law, we do have the ability to better monitor them, to de-radicalize them, to manage them better than would be the case if they are left in some of the countries.
You asked a question about the child as well. Britain and the US and other countries have signed up to treaties where we have a responsibility to bring back, a legal responsibility to bring back children who are British citizens or American citizens or other EU citizens and actually help to rehabilitate them if they've been in a war zone.
Well, let's talk.
I would like to push back on some of this. So, for instance, a 2018 study by Audrey Alexander and Rebecca Turkington demonstrated that in the United States context, female terrorists are less likely to be arrested or convicted, and they also receive more lenient sentences. And I think this idea that we need to bring these women home and try them in home courts, many of their crimes were not committed against, for instance, UK nationals. They were committed against the people of Iraq and Syria. And so there is an unsettled question of legal jurisdiction. And if we look to an important parallel, which I see as the fall of the Third Reich and denazification in Eastern Europe, we see that the United Kingdom itself executed a 22-year-old female Bergen-Belsen guard using a military trial. There have been other historical precedents for how to deal with the vast collapse of an armed group that victimized civilians across national lines. And I think that we're really ignoring some of these historical precedents, and we're also ignoring complex legal questions about jurisdiction and responsibility and indeed who the actual victims here are.
Let's try and come back to some of these questions in the next half hour. For now, Jessica Triscoe-Darden, Joana Cook and Haras Rafiq, thank you. We have to take a short break. Just to remind you, let us know what you think of the programme or any ideas for topics you'd like us to look into. Email us therealstory@bbc.co.uk. And if you enjoy the programme, we have a podcast. Subscribe, search for BBC The Real Story in your podcast app.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're asking what it's like being a woman in Ireland.
Being a woman in Ireland means I have my freedom, but I still can't avoid sexual harassment.
Being a woman in Ireland means that I have the same career opportunities as men, yet I can expect to get paid 13.7% less for my work.
Being a woman in Ireland today means being able to exercise my right to vote, yet being underrepresented in the political sphere.
The Irish people recently voted to allow access to abortion and to approve same-sex marriage. Soon, they'll have their say on removing a clause from the Constitution that effectively says a woman's place is in the home. I'm Kim Chaganetsa, and along with an audience at Dublin Castle, I'll be joined by a panel of 4 influential and outspoken women to discuss what it means to be a woman in Ireland today.
Being a woman in Ireland. Being a woman in Ireland.
The Conversation in Dublin, Saturday at 19 and Sunday at 12 GMT.
Coming up on The Real Story in the next half hour, should the women who left their homes to join the Islamic State group in Syria be brought back to face justice? If and when they return, is it possible to de-radicalise individuals who've been in the grip of a violent ideology? Is there a danger they'll act as a beacon for extremist recruiters in the future? And what about the children? That's all coming up after a summary of the world news.
BBC News with Debbie Russ. Bangladesh has told the UN Security Council it can no longer accept Rohingya Muslims who flee across the border from Myanmar and has accused the Burmese government of making hollow promises. Since a military campaign against the Rohingya in 2017, about 750,000 have poured into camps in Bangladesh. They say they fear for their safety if they return. An Indian fighter pilot captured by Pakistan on Wednesday is expected to arrive back in his country today. An Indian Air Force team is at a border crossing in Punjab to receive the pilot, whose plane was shot down in Kashmir during the military confrontation between the two nuclear-armed countries. Police in Somalia say a car bomb and gun battle in the capital, Mogadishu, have killed at least 20 people. 40 others were injured by the blast in front of a hotel. Exchanges of gunfire continued throughout the night between police and the suspected al-Shabaab militants. North Korean state media have described the Hanoi summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump as constructive and sincere, despite their different explanations of why talks broke down without a deal. There was no mention of the summit's abrupt end. Taliban fighters have attacked an Afghan military base in the southern province of Helmand. Reports say the attack began when a suicide bomber blew himself up near the base. Other attackers then joined the assault. Australia's Meteorology Department says the country has had its hottest summer ever. Heat waves in the past 2 months led to average and maximum temperatures almost a degree higher than records set 6 years ago. A referendum on the future of the Pacific island of Bougainville, due to take place in June, has been postponed. Officials said preparations for the vote on formal independence from Papua New Guinea were behind schedule and underfunded. It's now due in October. BBC News.
Welcome back to The Real Story with me, Ritula Shah. And this week we're discussing the fate of the women who travelled to Syria to join the Islamic State group and now find themselves unwanted and trapped in refugee camps. On our panel, Joana Cook from King's College London. She's been studying the role of women in violent extremism. Haris Rafiq from the counter-extremism organisation Quilliam International. And Jessica Triscoe-Darden, fellow with the American Enterprise Institute in Washington and co-author of Insurgent Women, Female Combatants in Civil War. In this half of the programme, we'll discuss how best to deal with the women and the children who lived under Islamic State if and when they return. Several thousand Europeans and many Americans who went out to join IS have already come back. Some live quietly, while some speak actively about how to help people de-radicalise. One of them is Tanya Joya, who's from London and went to Syria after marrying an American. She believes that people like Shamima Begum deserve a second chance, despite making statements that caused outrage in Britain.
We don't really have free agency. We give that up. Legally, I understand legally she's an adult, but I don't believe she's thinking like an adult. She's been living in a really backwards environment for 4 years. She hasn't read other value systems. I don't believe she's studied secularism or humanism or these things, and I think she hasn't had the chance to learn any better. 400 other ISIS members have returned to the UK before her, and they haven't been a threat. Not that we know of, because we don't know much about them. They've just been very quiet living in Britain. I don't know why she's being made an example out of.
Maybe because people have seen her speak. They're drawing their own conclusions. And yes, I will totally agree. We don't know the full story with Shamima. We don't know also what the government believes. But do you think people are perhaps talking about her or treating her differently because she is a 19-year-old woman as opposed to a 19-year-old man? I'm not sure they would talk in the same terms as they do when it comes to her, as if she mustn't have known her own mind.
Perhaps. The reason I care is because she has a baby. I mean, I totally understand why British people don't want to spend the money, their taxes, to help Shamima, but her child anyway, is still British and is innocent. We can't abandon a British national out there.
Tanya Joya speaking to my colleague Nuala McGovern. But public opinion is pretty divided. Here's how some people responded when we asked them whether Shamima Begum or others like her should return to their home countries.
I don't think we should let her back in. They made a decision to go and fight for the jihad, so they should stick with their decision. They shouldn't be allowed to come back. If they come back, they should be tried.
I think she should be allowed to come back. She's a British citizen, and I think it's said in the news as well, she's not a citizen anywhere else. She needs to have like a home to go to. but I think she should be arrested as soon as she gets back into the country and taken in for questioning and her kid taken away from her. I think she should be allowed to come back to the UK.
I think she absolutely should be able to come back home. We need to be better than the system that she's been forced into. We need to be the society that accepts that these things happen, and to be the people that say this is how we need to treat this and fix it.
I think it's reasonable to keep them out because I think it's a bit of a gendered view to think that just because they're women, they're not active participants in the military conflict. So I think they made the choice to leave, and I don't have a problem with them being refused entry back to the UK.
I think it's worth adding that a shooting range in England has been criticised for using images of Shamima Begum as a target. The management of the range said they'd responded to requests from customers with record numbers wanting Ms Begum as a target. So these people are controversial at best, hated by many. Can they be reintegrated? Harris, you seem quite optimistic that de-radicalisation can work.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at just our organisation to start with, our president is somebody who used to be a commander fighting alongside Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri. Our chairman spent 5 years in Mubarak's torture chambers for trying to recruit for an Islamic State. And we have many other people who have been foreign fighters themselves, who have disavowed the ideology and theology and now act as a force for good. We, as an organisation, Quilliam, have run these derad and rehabilitation, because it's not just about derad, it has to be de-radicalisation, it has to be about rehabilitation as well. I've run these programmes both here in the UK and in the US. In the US, we de-radicalise the youngest convicted terrorist, Mohammed Khalid, who now is living a normal life and actually helping to de-radicalise others.
Presumably, though, this takes time and money. There might be many people who say, well, why should we spend this money on these people?
Well, some of the best people that I've seen who have actually stopped people from becoming radicalised to this worldview are people that have been radicalised themselves in the past and have now come back.
Jessica, is this potentially could be viewed as a reward for bad behaviour?
I think that this ultimately speaks to the question of why we treat membership in these violent extremist organizations and terrorist organizations different than those who join, for instance, the military of an adversary state. If I left and joined, for instance, the Russian military, right, that would be considered treason. It would be pledging allegiance to a foreign state. And for some reason, because these groups don't have internationally recognized state status, we treat their members differently. I think it's also important to recognize that women were not only in Islamic State, they were on every side of this conflict. They're female foreign terrorist fighters, but there are also Yazidi women who were kidnapped and abused. There are women fighting in the Kurdish groups that are actually holding these ISIS women. And so in many sense, we are ignoring the contributions and the role of women in all of these other groups by focusing exclusively on ISIS women.
But in a sense, that might play to those who say, well, you are rewarding these women for their bad behaviour because actually the people who did other jobs that we may or may not, morally, immorally, that we may approve of, we aren't necessarily doing anything for them. They come back and slip back into society.
I think the most problematic part of some of the clips that you played is this focus that somehow because this woman has a child, that gives her some special status in society. That is just playing into a narrative that somehow mothers are different, or at the very least that those who have children need to be accorded special privileges. Presumably her husband also has this child, and he is not being treated differently because he has this new child. He is being held in detention in a camp. And I think that the complex question of what to do with children affiliated with ISIS highlights the fact that sorting out these competing claims to nationality is also going to be deeply problematic, right? There's this idea that Shamima Begum's child is a UK national and therefore the United Kingdom must repatriate that child. Well, presumably that child is also a Dutch national because that's the citizenship that its father holds. And so I think that it's not as simple as we would like to think.
But I think some countries, Joanna, have been very active in trying to get children back. I think Russia, for instance,
and
has...
France as well.
Yeah, so there's at least 2 cases that we've seen quite recently that have been very proactive in repatriating minors in particular, and that has been Russia and that has been Tajikistan as well. France has been more open to repatriating minors more recently as well, but again, we're dealing with such large numbers here. And I think to put this in a broader context, this was the largest mobilization of foreigners in any conflict in history for a non-state group like this. Islamic State currently has 10 branches and 22 affiliates around the world. This is a problem that we are going to be dealing with for the next 2 decades at a minimum. We've been dealing with Al-Qaeda since the late 80s now. This is something that will continue. And if we are not proactive with how we manage these populations now, including the minors, then again, the kind of concerns that come out of this are profound.
So, Harris, let's for a moment accept that you're right. It's possible to de-radicalise the parents, the mothers. But what about the children? What have these children seen? What have they been through?
Children haven't made that decision, slightly older children, they haven't made the decisions to go out there themselves. They've been taken out there or they've been born out there. They are traumatised. They will be deeply disturbed. And we have soldiers that have trained for years that go out to war zones and actually come back with trauma and stress. These are children, for God's sake. So they will need a lot of care and support. And from a safeguarding perspective, one of the things certainly we do in Britain is when there is a child that comes back with a parent, that child is taken away from the mother from a safeguarding perspective and then given some help and assistance until it's safe for that child to go back to the parent, if indeed she has been de-radicalised. Not everybody will be de-radicalised.
Joanna.
What we also see, if we look at Iraq and Syria right now, is that for children over there, starting from about the age of 5, we saw young boys in particular being trained in military tactics by this organization. The number of minors that have been exposed to this within Iraq and Syria right now, the number of orphaned minors over there, the ones that are now stateless, this concern, again, extends beyond just the children of foreign nationals that are still easily accessible and recognized. We're dealing with, again, large numbers of orphans over there that have lost both of their parents in these conflicts. Russia has highlighted a number of these cases that they're currently trying to identify, but from states where the citizenship has not been able to be passed down by the mother.
Just to pick up on the Russia point, it is interesting that Russia has been so proactive.
So one of the reasons why Russia and Tajikistan have been so forward-leaning in repatriating these children, and also in the case of Russia women, is that they themselves have faced civil wars. So we have the Russian conflict in Chechnya, but also the Tajik civil war that erupted in the early 1990s. And these countries have experience with demobilizing individuals from armed groups, with dealing with the social aftermath of civil conflict. And I think that they are in many ways better prepared to reintegrate these individuals in a way that Western countries do not.
Why don't?
Well, we've had the IRA for decades, and we've had children from Northern Ireland that have actually gone through a number of programs. So we do have some success also in the UK. But the thing here, it goes back to something that's a deeper question. I think we're in danger of talking about this phenomenon now as if, because ISIS has had the land taken away from them, that the war has been won, that it's all over. I remember in 2001, we were talking about Al-Qaeda-inspired extremism. Then we talked about Boko Haram inspired extremism, jihadism. Now we're talking about ISIS-inspired extremism. Well, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc. did not inspire extremism. Extremism inspired them. And if we don't get this right, there will be another acronym in a year, 2 years, whatever. And even now, we're seeing the biggest beneficiaries from a global jihadist insurgency perspective has been Al-Qaeda.
So with that happy thought in mind, then, isn't one of the dangers that many people may be fearful of that these individuals, when they go back to wherever they go back to, become the recruiters of the future?
Oh, absolutely. It's possible. But that's why we have these laws. I mean, only 10% of the people that have returned back from ISIS in the UK have been prosecuted, but that's because our laws didn't adapt quick enough after ISIS declared the Islamic State. So, and there's evidence thresholds and a whole bunch of different things.
Well, there is quite a structure in the UK, but I wonder, Jessica, if that's the case everywhere.
It's interesting that Haras mentioned that the legal system didn't catch up quickly enough. And so I think if we again look to historical parallels, during World War II, the United Kingdom passed the Treachery Act in 1940, which allowed the prosecution of individuals who conspired with other persons or agencies to endanger life. That act was repealed ultimately in 1967, but I think that this idea that we need to change our laws or adapt our justice mechanisms to changing security contexts is important, but it's often decried as well as, impinging on individual civil liberties. And I think that this is a really important debate to be had. And the question is, if we're going to bring these individuals back to their home countries and track their movements and monitor all of their communications, what good actually is that doing us? So, for instance, in Canada, a male fighter who was convicted of attempting to join Islamic State received 4 years jail time, had his internet cut off, his cell phone restricted, was released after 2.5 years. And so the question is this really dealing with the threat? And also, is this really bringing justice to those whose lives were destroyed by the actions of members of Islamic State?
Harris, that's certainly a debate that's had been had in the UK.
Absolutely. I remember that the UK was one of the first countries in the world to come up with the PREVENT strategy, which was taken to the US in around about 2009.
That has been extremely controversial.
Parts of it have. But there's one thing that people forget about the PREVENT strategy. The biggest part of it should have always been from the beginning the building of resilience amongst societies, British, Muslim societies, and now far left and far right, the triple threat as we call it. It was all about building the resilience so people don't get radicalized in the first place. And I want to pick up on what good will it do bringing these people back. Yes, we need to change our laws, and I agree with that. We need to adapt, etc. But one of the biggest impacts that this will have is that by bringing these people back, taking them through the due process, it shows a 15-year-old Muslim in Rochdale, in Leeds, or in Birmingham, or
that
somewhere else.
There are consequences.
There are consequences, but also it shows them that actually we are part of a group. We are British, and we're not going to have our citizenship taken away from us just because, in a way that other people who might not be brown or whatever won't have it taken away from them.
But is there an order here? Is there a sort of criminal justice versus de-radicalisation, or should it be the other way around? Or, Joanna, is this something that people get bogged down in? Which should come first? In a situation where people are reluctant even to entangle with these individuals, they don't necessarily want them back in the first place. And yet here we are talking about, if you like, the order in which things should happen.
Yeah, and I don't think these two areas are mutually exclusive. You can have criminal convictions, you can have those court processes, and you can have de-radicalization as well. With some of these individuals who might not be able to be convicted of actual crimes, there is still an opportunity to go through those de-radicalization processes. But I think one of the important aspects missing in this conversation so far is we're talking about bringing them back. But a real question for me is what happens if they stay? What happens next? Absolutely. And this is something that there's no good solution in this conversation right now, but there are better ones. If we look at what happens to these minors, in particular in Syria and in Iraq right now, for example, the ones being held by SDF forces. SDF forces have said they will not indefinitely hold them. So what does this mean for these minors of Canadian citizenship, of American citizenship, of British citizenship? The options become you get arrested by Assad's forces and go off to one of his prisons. The kind of activities that occur there, the kind of torture that's come out of these prisons is well documented. ISIS is now morphing into an insurgency locally. While they rejoin ISIS as the only community they've ever known, as the only identity or family they've ever known, will they join another insurgency group? Will they become delinquent in other ways?
Or will they become recruiters from there? Because you don't have to be in Britain to recruit somebody in Britain.
Although another way of looking at this is, Jessica, could they simply be tried in the countries where they're being held?
That has certainly been the approach thus far of some European governments. And so, for instance, we saw trials of ISIS women in Iraq where they were basically handed down death sentences in very short trials. And I think human rights activists have rightly pointed to the lack of legal representation and lack of legal clarity in those cases. But I think that that decision to hold individuals accountable in the states where they have committed crimes, I think is a very defensible position. Another option that hasn't been explored is the question of third country detention, third party detention. So it's very possible that we see a scenario where absolutely the Syrian Defense Forces, which are not a state actor, which have a very ambiguous legal position, should not be responsible for holding individuals in custody. I think we're not talking about that issue enough, but these individuals can be turned over to another state which is not Assad's Syria, and that needs to be seriously considered as well.
But why should they take them? That's the point. Why should they take them? It's not their problem.
To ensure that justice is served. And I think the reality is
but
we
if they have
all
the
know
if they
that
have the
there
death
is
penalty
needs to
also in
be
the region.
some process. Lots of countries have the death penalty.
And
We
so
all
should we-
know that there needs to be some process for sorting out the crimes that were committed and holding people accountable. Very similar to denazification after World War II, which was a system of establishing people's roles within the group, which was a way of establishing their culpability or non-culpability for certain crimes. The reality now is that if these individuals are brought back to their home countries, the clock starts running on many of these judicial processes, and there certainly is not enough time to gather the evidence that is required to hold them to account. It will take a very long time to track down all of the Yazidis who were kidnapped and enslaved and tortured under ISIS, and we need that time to ensure that justice is served.
Joanna.
We do have to recognize that the people who have suffered the most under Islamic State are the people of Iraq and Syria. They're the Yazidi populations, and these populations deserve justice. But we also have to remember that how they're moving forward from this period right now is very, very problematic in terms of the kind of long-term stabilization required for these countries, in terms of dealing with their own citizens who have become affiliated with the Islamic State. Even Iraq had detained upwards of 20,000 individuals with some kind of affiliation to Islamic State. So not only are these countries facing incredible numbers of their own citizens that have become affiliated with this organization and trying to move forward from this incredible violence. 30,000 individuals, citizens from those countries, have died under this conflict with ISIS. To maintain our own citizens over there, to take that responsibility off our own shoulders and to put it onto these countries, I think is a very problematic approach.
And I think also that the European Court would have a problem with allowing its citizens to be tried in a country where, A, they may not get the best legal representation, but secondly, the death penalty.
Jessica, I just want to turn a slight corner. You've raised the comparison with what happened after the Second World War. But are there other conflicts where women have played such a significant role in militias and within non-state actors that, in a sense, could provide a template?
I would argue that women have been the backbone, the foundation for insurgencies for decades. And in many ways, we shouldn't be surprised by the number of women that are coming out of ISIS, because when we look to other contexts, which range from, the Kurdish armed groups themselves that were fighting ISIS in Syria and Iraq, to the civil war in Colombia with the FARC, in which recently waged attacks, we look to all of these groups and we see women participating. 1 in 3 fighters in the Colombian conflict was a woman. We see similar levels in the Syrian Kurdish forces as well. And so the question is, what role should these women play in a post-conflict society? And I think that's where the divergence is between traditional armed or rebel groups and these terrorist organizations. That armed groups are fighting for a diversity of interests, right? And Kurdish nationalism, women's equality, empowerment, many reasons. The difference with women's participation in foreign terrorist organizations such as the Islamic State is that the focus on violence in this instance and the focus on destruction was so intense, and the ideology was so totalitarian. And I think that's why the comparison with Nazi Germany is actually apt, right?
Groups. I think Jess has got a very interesting point there. If you look at the father and not the grandfather of modern-day Islamism, Sayyid Qutb, he basically took arguments and ideas from Europe, predominantly being communism and fascism, imported them into the Middle East, and actually, instead of carrying out these totalitarian acts, this concept of this creation of a state, instead of doing it for the people in inverted commas or doing it for the state in inverted commas, he basically said do it for God. So there are so many similarities absolutely between Islamism, communism and fascism even. And I think one of the ways that we are going to defeat this long term is to actually recognize the similarities and treat Islamism in the same way, not Islam, but Islamism, in the same way that we do treat fascism and communism.
Just one other thought then. What about those who went to fight potentially against IS? You may see them as being on the right side. Some may interpret it as such. But actually, do we know if they took part in atrocities? How should they be treated, Joanna?
I think this is a very difficult one as well, and a lot of countries have stated that individuals that go over to fight, they have been prosecuted for their roles over there. But again, we're talking about very, very small numbers in terms of those of foreign citizens that went to join Islamist groups such as Al-Qaeda affiliated groups or ISIS.
I think to bring this back to the focus on women, what we demonstrate in Insurgent Women is that some of the Kurdish women who are fighting in the YPJ, which is the women's unit of the Syrian Defense Forces, are members of the PKK who've moved over from Turkey to fight in Syria, either because their families were originally from Syria or because, quite frankly, they have the tactical skills that are required. The PKK is a listed foreign terrorist organization, and I think many people have conveniently forgotten this fact because of the aid that the Kurds have provided in fighting ISIS. And so I think that it is again clear that we do treat individuals differently based on where they are situated in a conflict, but it's very important to note that women have been on every side of this conflict, whether it be women in Kurdish armed groups to, again, the Iraqi and Syrian civilians who bore witness to ISIS's violence.
So on that thought, I just want to wrap up really by thinking about the future. Whatever action governments decide to take, how long do you think that countries will be dealing with the aftermath of the decision of individuals, and today we've been talking about women, to join these violent groups? Joanna.
Right now, we are at a turning point where the responses that we create today for these women, for these minors, for these total populations that went are going to have an impact on the next 10 and 20 years of how this ideology, how these groups and how the groups that emerge from ISIS and beyond, how these roles unfold. And again, I'm going to emphasize the word pragmatic because I think it really is in terms of not only from a security perspective, but also being able to better manage and respond to this ideology and what actually drew individuals, so many individuals, to it in the first place.
Harris?
I don't believe we're at a turning point. I think the turning point was 9/11. And I think that we're in danger of making the same mistakes we've been making since 2001 and continually making those. I think that even if we get everything right, let's say there was a magic wand today and every country in the world made the right decisions to actually try and fix this problem, I don't think it'll be fixed in my lifetime. I think it's going to be certainly at least another generation, because we've had generations of people being told, Muslims around the world, through Islamist, Salafist theology and ideology, being told that the only way they can be a Muslim is to believe in the concept of a global Islamist caliphate and to impose a version of Sharia or fiqh. That's what we need to tackle long term. At the moment, all we're doing is tackling symptoms that are arising, and Shamima Begum is one of them, and they'll carry on. But the long-term struggle has to be defeating this ideology through hearts and minds. It's been said many, many times, but I really believe that.
Jessica?
I think it's frankly embarrassing that governments did not take this threat more seriously. We've known about the number of women who are joining ISIS for many years. There have been UN roundtables, there have been all sorts of discussions convened on this issue, and very few solutions have been offered. And it seems to me that the most appropriate framework that we have right now that we can adapt to this is the international legal framework around child soldiers. And I would just urge governments to do more work to make that happen as fast as possible.
Jessica Triscoe-Darden, Harris Rafiq and Joanna Cook, thank you all very much.